Right, then let's have a look at chapter 9 of The Great Gatsby, the final chapter. So the first quotation that I've chosen is this one. Catherine, who might have said anything, didn't say a word. She showed a surprising amount of character about it too. Looked at the corner with determined eyes under that corrected brow of hers and swore that her sister had never seen Gatsby, that her sister was completely happy with her husband. So this is Nick commenting on Catherine, who's Myrtle's sister, and the idea is that she didn't say a word, and obviously she knew. She completely knew that Myrtle was having an affair with Tom and really didn't like her husband, but she doesn't say that. And so in this case I'd say that Nick is probably surprised that Catherine has this, what he calls, character, because she's not betraying her sister for the sake of temptation of scandal and gossip, which she must love. She's part of that culture. But instead she says that Myrtle was always happy with Wilson. And so Nick's probably surprised because she's acting in a manner that is a little bit more dignified than her class would normally behave in, perhaps. So yeah, he's a little bit, I don't know, not confused by that, but impressed by it, I should think. Moving on, we've got this quotation that is, young Parke's in trouble. He said rapidly. They picked him up when he handed the bonds over the counter. And this is when Nick picks up a phone in Gatsby's house. And the idea is that we get a little bit of an insight into Gatsby's business and the illegal business. The idea is that money bonds are being handed over the counter, which is kind of like some kind of illegal gangsterism. And the idea that he's been picked up is probably the police picking him up for doing something illegal. It's not explicit. You have to imply it. So whilst Nick's given us a little bit of a glimpse into Gatsby's illegal activities, it may not be completely explicit, and he's still protecting him in a little bit. In a little way, so we have to imply, and so yeah, it means that Nick's not just out and telling us that Gatsby is involved in illegal alcohol trade. Moving on, we've got a little bit about Gatsby's father, who says, if he'd have lived, he'd have been a great man, a man like James J. Hill. He'd have helped build up the country. And James J. Hill was a railway tycoon, and a very famous one. He makes a huge amount of money building railways, like the first railway across across America, and it makes a huge amount of money. But it does show Gatsby's father is a little bit ignorant, and he doesn't appreciate the fact that his son is doing something that's illegal, and James J. Hill is actually somebody that helps build the country, whereas Gatsby is not following its laws, basically, so he's actually undermining the country. But he doesn't seem to realise that. He's just overawed by the amount of industry that his son has built up and the amount of money that he's accumulated. He also says his pride in his son and in his possessions was continually increasing, and now he had something to show me. So in this case, his pride in his possessions is kind of tragic, because his father feels pride in his possessions rather than his son's character. It shows that he's materialistic and shallow, which is kind of unfortunate for him. Gatsby's father then says, of course we was broke up when he run off from home, but I see now there was a reason for it. And in this case, you can pick up on the we was broke and he run off. And Gatsby's father speaks with really poor grammar. It either says that he's like talking with a colloquial accent, or that he's just poorly educated. And it shows us where Gatsby has come from. It shows us that actually he comes from this working class, this kind of poor environment. And then when he says, I see now there was a reason for it, the reason is the accumulation of wealth, basically, and Gatsby's father is awed by the amount that Gatsby has managed to accumulate in terms of the money that he has and his material possessions. And so he's kind of like thinking, yeah, this is absolutely fantastic, look how much my son's earned, and that's why he wanted to leave us, and he thinks it's a good justification. It's kind of sad because it values wealth rather than relationships. So maybe that is Nick being really cynical, and we basically don't agree with him here. We think that relationships are more important than money. Later on then we have West Egg, especially still figures in my more fantastic dreams. I see it as a night scene by El Greco, 100 houses at once conventional and grotesque, crouching under a sullen overhanging sky and a lustreless moon. So El Greco is a painter, and he paints these really awful, nightmarish, sinister cityscapes. They're really like not very pleasant to look at, and it presents this really awful view of New York, where once it was really kind of fresh and new and exciting for him, it's really cynical now and it's really horrible. And then it matches up with these like horrible words that Nick chooses to use. So grotesque, sullen, overhanging, lusterless. So there's no sheen to it, there's no shine to it anymore. It's really horrible now. And so his view of New York is drastically changed. It's not nice anymore. He doesn't like it. Moving on, we can talk about Nick's relationship with Jordan. She says to him, or they're on the telephone, and when I had finished, she told me that she was engaged to another man. I doubted that, though there were several that she could have married at a nod of her head, but I pretended to be surprised. So it's the end of the romance with Jordan, and he says he pretends to be surprised, and maybe this is to make it seem like he cared, but we can imply that he probably doesn't care, and he just doesn't want to upset her any further. Later on she says, "You said a bad driver was only safe until she met another bad driver. Well, I met another bad driver, didn't I?" And she's implying that Nick is this bad driver, and a bad driver is a metaphor for somebody that is, not very responsible and creates problems, basically. "I mean, it was careless of me to make such a wrong guess. I thought you were a rather honest, straightforward person. I thought it was your secret pride." So Jordan implies that both she and Nick are bad drivers, and I think there's somewhat of a similarity between Jordan and Nick here and Tom and Daisy, because they basically, as bad drivers, get into all kinds of scrapes and cause all kinds of trouble, and therefore they are not very good for the world. They're typical upper-class, old-money people that aren't very responsible. And then later you've got basically this, "I thought you were an honest, straightforward person." Jordan contradicts what Nick has told us, because Nick tells us all the time that he's one of the most honest people he's ever met. And so maybe we can't trust him as much as he seems to think we can. Maybe he's just as bad as everybody else. And we'll see a little bit more about this quotation, or a link to this quotation with Tom and Daisy later on. Later on then we have this. This is Tom talking to Nick. "What's the matter, Nick? Do you object to shaking hands with me?" And Tom knows that he's done something wrong. Tom knows that actually he's behaved in this immoral way, and he's waiting to see Nick's response. And so in this case, their relationship is really awkward, and Nick's realised how selfish Tom is, and so Tom's just waiting to see whether or not, how Nick's going to respond, how he's going to react. And later on he does actually shake Tom's hand, because he thinks, well, what's the point in arguing? And just like carries on with life, basically. He then says about Gatsby, "He threw dust into your eyes just like he did in Daisy's, but he was a tough one. He ran over Myrtle like he ran over a dog, and had never even stopped his car." So in this one, we've got, interestingly, the use of dust, and dust is where Gatsby comes from. It's symbolic of Gatsby's upbringing. Dust and ashes basically are the working class and the poor, and so he basically throws dust into the eyes of Daisy and Nick to pretend that basically he's a little bit better, he's a higher class than he actually is. And Tom's also implying that he isn't fooled by this, that Tom saw through this all along. He also said that he ran over Myrtle like he'd run over a dog, which is kind of ironic, knowing that Tom doesn't really care for Myrtle's dog when they're actually buying a dog. If it's a pure breed, fantastic, but he doesn't really care if it's a mutt. So it's kind of ironic in that case, and it's also ironic because he punches Myrtle in the face and breaks her nose, but he's being scornful of Gatsby for running down Daisy. You might also say this knowing that it was actually Daisy that ran down Myrtle, and he's implying that Daisy is guiltless, or maybe that Daisy has never even told Tom that she was the one driving that night. But that is definitely the story he's going to live with, and kind of ignore the awkward truth that it was Daisy that killed Myrtle, not Gatsby. Interestingly enough, later you've got this. "I went up to that flat and saw that damn box of dog biscuits sitting there on the sideboard. I sat down and cried like a baby. By God, it was awful." So in this case we've got Tom, I don't know if he's making out, is he feigning emotion so he cries? But that's not Tom, that's not the Tom that we've known. And so maybe he's just saying this to make him seem like a nicer person than he actually is. And then moving on, this quotation is the one that I like to link back to the bad driver quotation. They were careless people, Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money or their vast carelessness. So just like Jordan and Nick are careless drivers, or not very good drivers, so are Tom and Daisy. They smashed up things and creatures and then retreated back into their money. So their class covers everything up, basically. And you've got these really horrible, they smashed up things, to suggest that they have a really negative impact on the world around them and all the people around them. Moving on then, then he went to the jewellery store to buy a pearl necklace, or perhaps only a pair of cuff buttons. As if money is like the solution to everything, he resorts to buying stuff later, and so it could be a pearl necklace or a pair of cuff buttons. This is Nick speculating basically why he goes into this jeweller's, but he's saying that basically money's going to make things okay for Tom. As long as he can spend money, he'll feel good about himself. So he's retreating into his money, just like in the previous quotation here. Afterwards then he had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, which is a really negative, tragic quotation about Gatsby. And so, in this case, I would suggest that Fitzgerald's presenting Gatsby as a tragedy. He gets so close, but he doesn't realise that actually the closer he thinks he gets, the further away he actually is, and it was already behind him. He will never ever get there, which means that he'll never achieve his dream, he will never transcend his class boundaries, he will always stay in that same class that he was, and therefore he will never get Daisy. There's an interesting word here as well, grasp. I would suggest that you link this to Gatsby reaching for the green light, or the wisp of air in the previous chapters, because he's so hopeful and he's trying to reach it, and so in this case he could hardly fail to grasp it. It's so close, just like he's reaching for the green light in the first chapter, but actually it's never there. It's immaterial and he won't get it. Finally then, we have a couple more. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgastic future that year by year recedes before us, and then basically it says that he believes in the green light. He has hope, he always has hope, this romantic readiness in the first chapter, but it recedes, so it's getting further away, further and further away, and he doesn't seem to notice, whilst Nick does. He moves on to say, it eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch our arms further, and one fine morning, so we be on, boats against the current, borne ceaselessly into the past. So this is the final line, and it shows that now the tragedy is everybody's. Gatsby is thrown back into the past, so he returns to the dust or the ashes that he was born into, and Fitzgerald's telling us that's the same for all of us. We will all do the same. So we've got this collective or inclusive pronoun here, we, so it engages the audience as well, the reader. We're the boats on the current, and we're born ceaselessly back into the past. We're always going to go back to where we were born from. We can't escape it, which is the real tragedy that Fitzgerald is trying to present in this novel.